The world is changing. That's its nature. Alchemy Incorporated is changing with it because it's in our nature to adapt. For over 20 years, Alchemy Incorporated has maintained our standard of excellence by our ability to adapt, pioneering revolutionary new methods of alchemy across every industry. With every new challenge, we deconstruct and reconstruct our process to better meet the needs of an uncertain market without ever sacrificing our shared values. Competitors become potential allies, and workers, our family. This is how we continue to empower our clients to reach for even greater heights and create value by providing services at less than equivalent exchange. So when the world changes, we'll be ready, because change is in our nature.
You want to know the truth, young alchemist? I wonder what it'll cost you.
In May of 1960, Israeli Mossad agents executed Operation Finale, a top-secret operation with the aim of capturing a former Nazi high official by the name of Adolf Eichmann, who was living under the alias Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires. Adolf Eichmann was the man tasked with carrying out Hitler's final solution, the architect of the Holocaust, as he would later be called. He was successfully spirited away to Israel by the Mossad, where he would face a trial for his crimes against humanity. While the trial itself was mostly for show, Eichmann's skill was never really in question. It provided the Jewish people acting through the state of Israel a chance to pass judgment for the atrocities committed against them, something that had not been the case in previous trials of this nature. There to report on the events of the trial for The New Yorker was a German-born Jewish woman by the name of Hannah Arendt. Arendt, a philosopher and political theorist, compiled her reporting and thoughts on the trial into a novel which she titled Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. In the book, Arendt lays bare an unsettling schism between the evil committed and those that commit it, proposing the idea that monstrous acts do not have to be committed by monsters, but by people, who by every measure are normal and with banal motivations. In her own words, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that many were neither perverted or sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. The novel elicited harsh reactions and a storm of controversy, some taking issue with Arendt's framing of Eichmann, and others with her criticism of Jewish leadership in Germany leading up to the Holocaust. Many tried to discredit her work wholesale, decrying her as, quote, a self-hating Jew, and one review going as far to ask of Arendt, is she a Nazi? She would go on to defend her perspective until the day she died. However, the critics of Eichmann in Jerusalem failed to take away from the underlying ideas on the nature of evil that it revealed, and it can be argued that engaging with those ideas is more relevant now than ever before. Let's talk about Fullmetal Alchemist. Brotherhood is a Japanese animated series based on the popular manga series Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromi Arakawa, not to be confused with the first attempted animated adaptation, Fullmetal Alchemist, which ended its run almost 5 years earlier, albeit quite differently, as the production company Bones was allowed to work independently from the manga author, and thus ended with Edward fighting Nazi ninjas, and oh boy, I've already lost some people, so stop. Look, this essay will be focused on Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and its telling of the story which follows the events of the manga. I'm not making any judgments on the original anime as I have not seen it all the way through, so stand down, weebs. I assure you, I have no beef with you. Okay, let's start again. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is a Japanese animated series based on the popular manga series Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromi Arakawa, originally released in Japan in 2009 and then to North American audiences on Adult Swim in 2010. It is a great series. The characters and world are engaging, the animation is fantastic and at times truly stunning, and it features some of the best animated opening songs of all time. Sorry, where was I? Right. Fullmetal Alchemist is the story of Edward and Alphonse Elric, two brothers attempting to regain their bodies after losing them in an attempt to bring their mother back to life using alchemy. We will get to more of the specifics of that later. I would argue that Brotherhood is one of the most concise animes ever put to television. With a total of only 64 episodes, the series has a sense of vision, a clarity about where it's heading, and how to use its time wisely, something not found in many other shonen animes, and as a completely realized series, FMA has a ton of thematic depth. Oh, there's another eye. Look at, there's another eye. That's an eye, there's an eye. Something to do with eyes. I think eyes. Okay, pack it up, I figured it out. Something 1984. Like any great work of art, Brotherhood is open to being read in many different ways, making engaging with it like drinking a fine wine. Just when you feel like you've got it figured out, you might get hints of something new. Or at least that's what those fucking wine salesmen keep telling me at the liquor store while I'm trying to buy my margarita mix in peace, you bourgeois pig. What I want to explore is how FMA depicts what Hannah Arendt described as the banality of evil, and its relationship with capitalism and the neoliberal ideology. But frankly, I don't think that is a controversial enough discussion to drive engagement on YouTube, so Maze Hughes deserved to die. Fuck Maze Hughes!
Back at it like a crack addict, Mr. Black Magic, crack a bitch back, chiropractic, craftmatic, Nick, daddy smoking big, Cali in a black, alley in a black 4.
Can you state your full name for the record, please?
Edward Joseph Eichmann.
Thank you. And what is the title of your position and employer?
I am head of logistics at Alchemy Incorporated.
Thank you. Can you describe to us the relationship between Alchemy Incorporated and the defendant FreedomWorks?
Alchemy Incorporated contracts out to FreedomWorks for various research projects and labor needs.
FreedomWorks ran and operated private prisons, correct?
That is correct.
And it's our understanding that you were directly in charge of all logistics involving FreedomWorks.
Yes.
We've also heard from your bosses during this that you are quite good at what you do.
Well, I should hope so. I take great pride in what I do.
So, is it safe to say that you knew the extent to which Alchemy Incorporated was using FreedomWorks' services?
Well, I was never involved in the day-to-day operations personally, but as they say, someone has to keep the trains running on time. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood takes place in the country of Amestris. It is a military-run state engaged in conflict on every border with imperialistic tendencies who is engaged in the genocide of an indigenous religious group known as the Ishvalans. So, in no uncertain terms, they're fascists. And pretty specifically, the Nazi variety. This isn't the first time an anime has played around with themes of fascism, both Attack on Titan and Kill la Kill come to mind, but I would argue that no other anime is as blatant, so eager to dash any doubt you might have that what you're seeing is the aesthetics of Nazi Germany. The look of the country, the time period it seems to be replicating, the genocide, and just in case there was any doubt at all, the military leader is literally named Führer King Bradley. It ain't subtle. Also, maybe it's worth discussing the problematic choice of making your Hitler stand-in an absolute daddy?
Daddy as fuck. I feel daddy as fuck. Daddy as fuck. I feel daddy as fuck. I feel.
Just in case I needed to address it, Hitler was not a strong man in any sense.
Fuck off, Hitler.
Even elements unrelated directly to the plot and setting are used to subtly imply the connection. Take the music of the show, composed by Akira Senju and performed by the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra. The music shares many traits with the works of Wagner, Hitler's favorite composer, and more broadly the traditional music that Nazi Germany thought of as superior. We can also contrast that with the track simply titled The Fullmetal Alchemist. This track is haunting, and the melody is simple, so unlike the grand music of nationalist propaganda, and calls to mind, well, to my mind, the theme of Schindler's List, itself a composition influenced by the music of Eastern European Jews. I'm no music theorist, but we cannot and should not view these things in a vacuum. We can also look at the ways the show more subtly uses the tropes associated with fascism to flip them on their head. For instance, Major Alex Louis Armstrong embodies, on the outside, an appeal to both tradition and general ideas of masculinity common amongst fascist regimes.
Incredible valor! Respectable muscles!
But as a character, he is much more emotional and empathetic than almost every other character, undermining the fascist ideal by displaying emotions and love as being in line with strength. What makes all this work so well is that by placing our heroes within the hierarchy of a fascist regime, we can view them as people instead of monsters. Now, I'm not saying the show is trying to have us empathize with Nazis, far from it. The show is pretty openly critical of fascism and imperialism, but rather allows us to engage with the characters and their individual motivations. This, much like the Trial of Eichmann for Arendt, makes us question the very nature of evil, as it seems to lose the characteristics we associate with it. We have a tendency to want to categorize evil as something with its own will, something that corrupts and demands blood. Radical evil, as coined by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And this was largely agreed upon even by Arendt, but as she later observed, only good can be radical. Evil, as she states it, can never be radical. It can only be extreme, for it possesses neither depth nor any demonic dimension. Yet, and this is its horror, it can spread like a fungus over the surface of the earth and lay waste the entire world. And she's right. Even today, it seems we cannot help ourselves but try and blame some outside force for acts of evil. For example, when the country was seeing an epidemic of mass shootings, much of the time you would run into the dismissive claim that the shooter had a mental illness. In fact, this is kind of a twofer, because it works to both demonize people with mental health issues and shift the blame to some sort of force that corrupted them. 2 for 1 at that price? What a bargain! In part, media has helped perpetuate this idea. When we think of evil in its most pure form, most of us would picture the Nazis, because aside from the atrocities we know they committed, most media that either depicts Nazis directly or has villains that share a likeness to them seem complacent to boil them down to cartoon supervillains. Just a bunch of, dastardly daddies. Dastardly daddies, what the fuck? Just a bunch of dastardly baddies who in their heart of hearts are just pure evil. And while I personally see the utility of making the Nazis and their ideology appear silly and buffoonish, because they are, I also think that paired with a lack of understanding to how the Nazis came to be, it returns us to an understanding of evil more in line with the teachings of Sunday school, when the reality is that the events of World War II made us question that dynamic in the first place. It just wasn't possible to understand the events of the Holocaust within the old framework of good and evil. And what's a more on-the-nose way of exploring this than pinning the protagonist against the literal 7 deadly sins? The question the show seems to pose, and the question we seem to find ourselves asking of the real world quite often, is how can normal and otherwise good people commit the most unthinkable evil? This cast of characters, some being quite honorable and kind, are also directly responsible for genocide, including Hughes the sick fuck. Oh, he's so cute and he loves his daughters so much. Well, guess what, sweetie? Daddy is a mass murderer. Now, I know what you may be wondering. What does any of this have to do with capitalism? Well, let's talk about alchemy.
$70 grams carbon, 80 grams water, 10 grams citric acid, 1 gram phosphorus, and trace amounts of various other elements. Those are the elements needed to create a perfect whiskey sour. And whatever elements make up a Marciano cherry. You need to drink every once in a while when you're trying to understand the truth of this world. Or in my case, the truth of capitalism. But to understand that, we have to understand alchemy. Alchemy is a quasi-science and natural philosophy concerned with turning base metals into gold or silver. The word alchemy comes from Old Latin and is derived from the Arabic word alchemia. Al meaning the, which incidentally is the same as alcohol, and chemia, which means chemistry and is rooted somewhere in ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian. Nobody's quite sure. In the show Fullmetal Alchemist, alchemy is described as a science concerned with deconstructing and reconstructing matter, and abides by a principle known as equivalent exchange, which is described thusly.
Alchemy, the science of understanding, deconstructing, and reconstructing matter. However, it is not an all-powerful art. It is impossible to create something out of nothing. If one wishes to obtain something, something of equal value must be given. This is the law of equivalent exchange.
In this way, we can begin to see alchemy as kind of a mode of production. Let's take making this whiskey sour and pair it with a scene from episode 3 of Fullmetal Alchemist, City of Heresy. We start with the base components and we rearrange them to create a commodity. Now, this would not be possible without some tools for the job, which function a lot like the transmutation circles in Fullmetal Alchemist, that being a thing that allows the transmutation to occur. And lastly, and most importantly, the labor needed to make it happen, which is the alchemy, the magic. Much like alchemy, labor is an energy that requires the guidance of imagination. In a sense, you're bringing a part of your soul into material existence. As Carl's Jr. once wrote, "We are not dealing here with those first instinctive forms of labor which remain on the animal level. An immense interval of time separates the state of things in which a man brings his labor power to market for sale as a commodity from the situation when human labor had not yet cast off its first instinctive form. We presuppose labor in a form in which it is exclusively a human characteristic. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of a weaver, and a bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what separates the worst of architects from the best of bees is that the architect constructs the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labor process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purposes in those materials." Arendt also makes a similar distinction, but she separates these two into different terms. Labor, which is just the things we do to continue existing, like eating, breathing, pooping, everybody does it, I read it in a book. And work, which is described by Arendt as the bringing of something durable into the world. And she goes as far as to separate these two into different realms, the earth in which you are conducting labor, and the world in which you are conducting work. Okay, so we've seen how the alchemy of the show can be viewed as an economic mode of production, the transformation of base materials into commodities. It could even be said that economics are kind of the purest form of alchemy, as you are literally turning commodities into gold. Well, not literally, because we don't use gold to buy and sell things anymore. There is one more aim of alchemy that is not so dissimilar from the first, and that's the creation of a philosopher's stone.
Story this evening Alchemic Incorporated is facing harsh criticism after a whistleblower leaked emails revealing that upper management was aware of and actively encouraged harsh working conditions that led to prisoner deaths.
Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters.
From here on out, there will be major spoilers for Fullmetal Alchemist, so you have been warned. For alchemy, the ultimate achievement is the creation of a Philosopher's Stone. It is, in theory, a pure object, and therefore would grant its creator immortality. In the quest to regain their bodies, Ed and Al first set their sights on the obtainment of one of these stones, because outwardly, it appears as though the Philosopher's Stone bypasses the law of equivalent exchange entirely, in possibly creating things out of nothing.
But somehow he's ignoring the law of equivalent exchange. He should have only been able to transmute that flower into an object of equal mass.
And he's changing organic matter into inorganic matter. He shouldn't be able to do that, unless...
Yeah, there's just one way. Bingo.
But it is not too long before they are confronted with the truth. The creation of a Philosopher's Stone requires the sacrifice of humans.
The main ingredient for a Philosopher's Stone is human life. In order to manufacture even a single stone, you have to make multiple human sacrifices.
In the world's mechanics, the stone is not a way of bypassing the law of equivalent exchange, but rather a logical extreme. In function, the more people sacrifice, the more powerful the stone, and by extension, the owner of the stone. If we add in our economic understanding of alchemy, we finally have our capitalist model, the creation of profit through the extracted value of others' labor. And obviously, the resulting production and means to it are privately owned. The disembodied souls that power the Philosopher's Stone don't really get a say in their use.
All that's left is energy to be consumed.
Later in the show's plot, we come to find out that the genocide of the Ishvalans and the warfare on Amestris' borders are part of a conspiracy to create a powerful Philosopher's Stone, orchestrated by the show's main villain, Father, and various high-ranking members of Amestris' military. Father, or the Dwarf in the Flask as he is known before he assumed the form of Edward and Alphonse's father, is the result of merging with a powerful Philosopher's Stone, a Philosopher's Stone created by sacrificing the former city of Xerxes. His ultimate goal is to consume God, which he does. You know, real rags to riches tale. Fullmetal Alchemist uses Father in the application of alchemy to explore how capitalism as an economic model demands endless growth, which in turn necessitates imperialism and exploitation as a means of sustaining itself. There is a somewhat simplistic but not inaccurate portrayal of the relationship between the accumulation of capital and the real dissipation that occurs to make that happen. And this is not an accident, it is by design. You cannot have so much without taking. A billionaire simply cannot provide enough of their own labor to justify the disproportionate level of wealth they claim ownership over. It has to come from somewhere. This is reflected in the trajectory of capitalist nations. Right now, we live in an age where wealth continues to become concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, to the extent that economic inequality is as bad as it was in the Gilded Ages. In alchemy, the aim to turn base metals into gold and the quest for immortality are one and the same. And the same applies to capitalism as well. The impossible accumulation of wealth is a stand-in for immortality. Pointing out capitalism's relationship with immortality is not really new either. Karl Marx famously used vampires, beings that consumed others' blood to maintain their vitality, as a way of analyzing the way capitalists maintain themselves by extracting value from the working class. This adversarial relationship becomes even more clear when there is any kind of existential threat to this system of accumulation, like when Father uses up his Philosopher's Stone and desperately stumbles around looking for someone else to sacrifice for a new one.
But I also think there is a financial suicide and the death of companies and small businesses and restaurants and the economy and the global economy that has to be weighed against. We shouldn't force anyone to go to work.
You vile human! Give it to me! No Edward! Their energy!
Let's just open the economy and let her rip.
However, there is also an allusion to something deeper in Fullmetal Alchemist. In the novel Escape from Evil, social theorist Ernest Becker attempts to put forward an understanding of contemporary forms of evil by exploring the roots of human shift from spiritual extensions of mortality to the material and economic. As he writes, power means power to increase oneself, to change one's natural situation from one of smallness, helplessness, finitude, to one of bigness, durability, importance. And as he expands upon later, capital is the means by which to symbolically expand oneself. In FMA, the alchemical process that operates much like an economic mode of production and is described as a science, uses the imagery of archaic ceremony and ritual, further emphasizing the connection between the primitive and the spiritual to contemporary methods of expanding oneself. This also isn't a new idea when we think of how often the depiction of the upper class has an occultist angle steeped in demonic rituals and sexual deviance. And that actually works with our previous discussions of how evil is portrayed as a played-up version of the more boring reality. And I think FMA does a great job of balancing the two by having the ritual aesthetic, but brought down to the level of banal science experiments. Now, there might be some objection to the assertion that capitalist expansion and the theft of value from people is comparable to genocide and ethnic cleansing, but that would be ignoring capitalism's major role in each of those things. Imperialism is an extension of the needs of capitalism, as it functions to secure more resources for the growing interests of the upper class. Forced starvation, slavery, and genocide are evils that historically work to benefit the wealthy under the capitalist model.
You mentioned that souls would be bonded to them. Where do you plan on procuring these souls?
From rival lands, of course. Citizens from the countries we ravaged during the course of war.
I think it would be somewhat foolish and wrong to think of the ideology that drove the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, as just some innate hatred of people with different skin tones. Much of its creation was about generating profit. The entrenched white supremacist belief system, mostly, but not entirely, came as a way to justify the obvious inequality and horror that was needed to make it work. This becomes pretty obvious during moments in history such as the founding of the United States, whose founders outwardly derided slavery as an evil and claimed the country to be founded on the basis of full equality, while in actuality, not only continued the practice of slavery, but built the country and its wealth on the backs of slaves. The wealth they needed to fight a war against their tax collectors. And that's without even getting into the genocide of the Native Americans. Though, I should note that racism can and does exist separate of class. Even when Black Americans achieve success through the capitalist framework, such was the case of Black Wall Street, they will still be met with fierce and horrifying acts of oppression. But still, it is the capitalist mode of production that requires this inequality to function in the first place. We continue to see more horror and destruction carried out this way in the present, with war being a mechanism of constant revenue and profit generation. But if that's the case, as it is in the show, you would need a lot of people willing to commit horrible acts of evil in order to make any of this work. And here is how we arrive back at the banality of evil, in Arendt's exploration of Eichmann. Because fascism and capitalism operate through many of the same ideological justifications. There is a reason that fascist countries, though diverse in their presentation, never actually call capitalism into question, and why capitalism, in turn, embraces fascism with open arms.
Welcome back to the show. Today we're sitting down with Ed Eichmann, head of logistics at Alchemy Inc., to discuss the trillion-dollar company's past, future, and how it plans to meet its growing infrastructure needs. Mr. Eichmann, pleasure to have you on the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
I should start off by congratulating you on becoming the world's first trillion-dollar company.
Thank you.
That's quite impressive.
Thank you very much.
Now, the question on everyone's mind is, where does Alchemy Inc. go from here?
Well, that's a trillion-dollar question, isn't it? You know, the world has changed so much in the last 20 years, and keeping with the law of equivalent exchange, Alchemy Incorporated is changing with it to meet the shifting needs of the market.
Can you provide an example?
Well, in the last year, we've added 20 new research and development centers globally, as well as employed 100,000 new alchemists to our team, with plans on reaching even greater heights in the coming quarter.
Quite a lot of work.
Yes. It's very hard work. But what they say is true, hard work does pay off. And we at Alchemy Incorporated, we see ourselves as a family. And just like I work hard for my family, they work hard for each other.
Now I should address the elephant in the room. Freedom Works, a private prison outfit that you oversee, has been accused by various activists and journalists of using what is tantamount to slave labor.
Now,
and that multiple prisoner deaths have been linked to harmful practices that company executives knew at the time. How do you respond to these accusations?
Now, I should just say that I'm not high enough on the corporate ladder to be considered responsible for the use of prison labor. Those decisions are best left to the CEO and his board of directors. My responsibility is to the corporation and our shareholders, not to criminals, if I may put it bluntly. Now, I'm as upset over this ordeal as any person. I don't wish ill will on any human being. But let's get one thing straight. These are not slaves. They're people who have broken the law. And we are giving them the chance to give back to society. In alchemy, we would call that equivalent exchange. Now, I think I did the best with the bad situation that was put upon me by the powers that be. It's not as though we put these people in prisons.
And the deaths?
Well, they weigh upon me more than you can imagine. The fact is, I sent men and women to their deaths at the behest of my superiors, and it's my hope to set things right by being here to talk about it. But it's also a fact that I did the job to the best of my ability, and that is not illegal. I should think it a much greater crime to be poor at one's job, don't you think? Now, we've launched an internal review into this matter, and there will be some corporate restructuring down the pipeline.
When we come back, how is Alchemic Inc. gearing up for the busy holiday season? And we'll discuss those embarrassing beach photos of Mr. Eichmann, released in USA Today. All that and more when we return.
So if not driven by hatred, malice, or madness, how then does Arendt try to explain the motivations behind Adolf Eichmann's enormous contribution to the most horrifying atrocity of the 20th century? Where did her concept of the banality of evil even stem from? Above her many other observations, Arendt points the finger at Eichmann's inability to think, which she makes sure to distinguish from mere stupidity. In Arendt's mind, thinking is namely the act of thinking from another's perspective, to engage in a Socratic dialogue of some kind, and more broadly, the act of engaging in critical thought. A couple of things during the trial led Arendt to this conclusion, but the biggest one was Eichmann's overuse of cliches. To clarify, we're not talking about cliches as we might understand them now, or rather, in the pop culture sense.
I hate that cliche.
By cliches, Arendt was referring to a collection of stock phrases, jargon, and references that Eichmann would repeat and lean on in lieu of any original thought of his own. According to Arendt, Eichmann was, quote, genuinely incapable of uttering a single sentence that was not a cliche. It's not really that the use of cliches are in and of themselves insidious, we all use them. But Eichmann's constant use of them suggested that at no point did Eichmann ever have to renegotiate with the world around him. He was, in a sense, shielded from outside ideas, or as Arendt writes it, cliches, stock phrases, adherence to conventional, standardized codes of expression and conduct have the socially recognizable function of protecting us against reality. That is, against the claim on our thinking attention, which all events and facts arouse by virtue of their existence. The difference in Eichmann was only that he clearly knew of no such difference at all. Important to understand was that Arendt didn't have much interest in trying to understand Eichmann's psychology. Frankly, there had been enough psychiatrists brought in to try and diagnose him, all of whom qualified Eichmann as normal, or as the Israeli court psychiatrist put it, more normal at any rate than I after examining him. And all of them had failed to notice that the man spoke in what boiled down to Nazi Instagram posts. Her attention is on the political implications and the Nazis' war on thought. To understand through Eichmann the nature of politics that works to undermine thought. By looking at cliches, we can draw parallels between different ideologies. A cliche common to fascist movements, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and neoliberalism is a reliance on the perception of a type of natural law. We've actually already talked about the type of natural law that underpins the ideology of the various citizens of Amestris, the law of equivalent exchange. The law of equivalent exchange is a seemingly straightforward proposition to the way alchemy functions, but it is often referred to outside of the realm of alchemy and as a guide for the nature of the world itself. Beyond alchemy, there is nothing to suggest that the universe, or truth, or God, or whatever, operates under these mechanics, that people can't operate outside the principles of equivalent exchange. In fact, the show goes to great lengths to demonstrate that the world doesn't function this way, and that the result of doing so is a stunted understanding of reality with grave consequences. There are things that the law of equivalent exchange cannot explain or determine, so the law of equivalent exchange becomes a cliché, invoked without much real thought to whether or not it has any relevance whatsoever.
An occupational hazard. It's just the way I think.
Let's look at an early example from the show, possibly the most well-known sequence of events in the show, the story of Shao Tucker. In an attempt to learn more information on the recovery of their bodies, Edward and Alphonse turn to an amestrist alchemist by the name of Shao Tucker, the only alchemist that has been successful in the creation of a chimera, an animal creature with human intelligence. Shao is presented as a somewhat overworked single father who is concerned about losing funding from the state if he cannot create a new chimera. He is seemingly kind and mild-mannered, as well as a good father to his daughter Nina, who we get to know through Edward and Al's day spent playing with her. So here comes the gut punch. When Shao's due date for his research arrives, our protagonists find that Shao has managed to create a chimera, but quickly come to the horrifying realization that Shao did so by alchemically combining his daughter with his dog.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
What Shao offers up as an explanation is basically empty platitudes, cliches if you will.
I don't see what you're so upset about. This is how we progress.
And the rest of the show is littered with these instances.
You're asking me to take your life in place of the remaining tens of thousands of Ishvalans. The life of any individual human is only worth one life. That's all. Nothing more and nothing less. Your life is not enough to call off the extermination.
You of all people should know great deeds require great sacrifice. Isn't that the law of equivalent exchange?
Destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. You must destroy to create. That is the law of the universe.
The natural law that dominates our cliches is quite similar. Stop me if you've heard this one before. You're having a conversation about the COVID-19 pandemic with somebody, since the only other topics of conversations are the world being on fire, police brutality, and America's flirtations with fascism, and as you try to explain the need for the government to materially meet every citizen's base needs in order to halt the spread of the disease, they respond with something to the effect of, survival of the fittest. Bruh. Now, even a moment of critical thought would be enough to dismiss such a ridiculous misuse of the concept, survival of the fittest. But it has become such a cliche of the neoliberal mindset that not many think to question it at all.
Survival of the fittest in action. Your luck was strong, so you survived.
Just like with how characters use the law of equivalent exchange in Fullmetal Alchemist, the cliche cloaks itself in the language of academia, extending an understanding of a specific scientific or philosophical principle past its breaking point. Because capitalism relies on a model of competition, domination, and hierarchies, the cliches mostly invoke a view of nature that reflects those ideals. Survival of the fittest, kill or be killed, consider the lobster. You might also recognize certain attributes of this in the way the Nazis used animals to depict their supposed superiority, likening themselves to lions, falcons, or frankly any predator so long as it sits firmly on top of the food chain.
If one were to determine what attribute the German people share with a beast, it would be the cunning and the predatory instinct of a hawk. But if one were to determine what attributes the Jews share with the beast, it would be that of the rat. If a rat were to scamper through your front door right now, would you greet it with hostility?
When you notice an insect on the ground, do you stop to consider it a fool?
Thank you, George Borwell, for that clunky analogy in defense of totalitarianism.
There is a certain simplicity that lies at the heart of these ideas, a kind of childlike understanding of nature and its relation to society, and that simplicity becomes its pervasiveness. You can find these ideas bleeding into everything from health to relationships. This functions to insulate the framework from scrutiny. That's just the way it is. Welcome to the real world. That kind of cultural insulation from any ideas outside of the capitalist framework has been described by cultural theorist Mark Fisher as capitalist realism. Capitalist realism, as I understand it, cannot be confined to art or to the quasi-propagandistic way in which advertising functions. It is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. It might be easy in our hyper-individualized culture to look for blame within the individual, but this is just not how things work. The inability to think critically is not some moral failure of a single person, and even if it was, it could hardly account for acts of mass evil. The reason these cliches matter is because they indicate a wider cultural agreement. The critical thought needed to break free from these constraints is a muscle that simply needs to be exercised, but for the status quo, needs to remain atrophied. This is why education is laid out the way it is in a capitalist society. No longer is the goal to simply educate, but to prepare children to be a part of a standardized workforce. It instills a sense of conformity and submission to authority, especially in places that literally arrest children for skipping school, and yes, that is a thing that still happens. This is a quote from an essay entitled Global Capitalism and the Restructuring of Education. This neoliberalization of higher education converts the university worldwide into the domain of the elite, and of that 20% of global society that have the resources to finance their education and to train for taking commanding roles in global society. At the same time, it heightens the ideological role that education plays in insulating dull minds with respect for authority, obedience, and a craving for petty consumption and fantasy. That is, the banal culture of global capitalism and its dehumanizing value. Neoliberal restructuring, and most importantly privatization, opens up educational systems to transnational capital, both as a new space for accumulation and as a brain trust for capitalism itself. Transnational capital has invaded the university and educational system in every sense. From converting education into a for-profit activity, to commissioning and appropriating research, often publicly funded, while simultaneously generating a major new source of financial speculation through student loans. Another way that capitalists can do things that, when laid out properly, would be considered bad is by the use of euphemisms. Arendt describes the way in which Nazi high officials often spoke openly about plans without causing alarm by using coded language, and that it also had the dual effect of dulling the rhetoric in those same officials' minds. Language has power. How we use it can often morph our own understanding of the world. Anybody that is familiar with the Southern strategy is familiar with how this was weaponized against equal rights in the United States.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me?
But this is also extremely important to understanding the way capitalists have used language to stifle the efforts of those seeking economic justice. For example, calling anti-union legislation right to work, or mass firings in favor of cheaper labor being called corporate restructuring. What we're left with is an extremely insulated society. When laid out this way, it sounds almost dogmatic. And it is. Fullmetal Alchemist actually gives us a setup to this relationship. Early on, once again referring to the episode City of Heresy, where Ed and Al find a city whose citizens are all deeply indoctrinated with ideology from the Church of the Sun God Leto, pledging unwavering loyalty to the priest who is passing off alchemy as miracles. There is a lot to unpack in this episode, not least of which is the episode's placement in the series. The early introduction of religion, and more specifically, how religious ideology that justifies trust and unjust hierarchies creates situations where good people do bad things, highlights a very clear example of a criticism the show later applies to alchemy and capitalism by extension. Also, the sun was used to symbolize golden alchemy, do you get it? We might also interpret it to be the way that religious institutions have coupled so well with capitalist thought, despite the fact that the ideologies that drive them are seemingly at odds. Consider the spiritual mobilization, a period of time where religion reshifted its focus into fitting the framework of a capitalist system, securing Christianity's marriage to capitalism through appeals to a new sense of God-given freedom that could be realized by the free market. Religion simply traded the invisible hand of God for the invisible hand of the market, and profits for entrepreneurs. From capitalist dogma, how do we make the leap to fascism? I should make it clear that neoliberalism and fascism are not the same, but that the former helped set up the latter through similar ideological structures. Fascism is an inherently reactionary ideology, and by looking at past fascist movements, and present ones, it is clear that, in part, the reaction is to a failure of capitalism. If capitalism is justified with the idea that there is a natural order to the world, that people are a part of some hierarchical structure from which the free market determines their place like some sort of natural selection, how then do people deeply supportive of those ideas react to capitalism in crisis? They determine, with help of those who are in the unique position of taking advantage of that anxiety, that something, or more often, some people, have disrupted the natural order. Somebody has stepped out of line. Much like religion is weaponized against the LGBT community for going against God's will, and subsequently causing all the problems with the world, the ideology that drives capitalism is weaponized against those most vulnerable in order to explain its own failures. I didn't lose my factory job because it was more profitable for the company to hire Chinese labor cents on the dollars. It was because of those Mexicans coming over the border to steal my work with the help of George Soros and the rest of the leftist cabal. You can easily see how this feeds into ultranationalism, scapegoating, anti-intellectualism. You know, the hallmarks of any fascist movement. As the grotesque and fast-evolving fascist movement QAnon would say to those who might at any moment question the actions they stand behind, trust the plan. The enemy is never something as formless as an entire system. It is a series of figures and their collaborators, in Q's case, literal demonic cults, who can be removed, usually by some strongman figure and those that support him. To literally rid the world of evil. Trust the plan. Ironically, the strongman figure is usually a benefactor and creation of bourgeois society, just like how Fuhrer Bradley, or as he is later revealed to be Wrath, was a man bred and raised to lead this new neoliberal order, emerged with a Philosopher's Stone. Incidentally, he was raised in the same lab as Pete Buttigieg.
You've had direct experience of many of the things that make a lot of young people very angry about the way that this country is operating right now. You don't seem to embody that anger.
So the proposition that I've been on front lines of corporate price fixing is just to get that out of the way.
You worked for a company that was fixing bread prices.
Both fascism and capitalism endlessly create new enemies as a means of growth and propose itself as the solution to what it itself has caused. An Ouroboros, if you will, the symbol of the homunculi, beings created by alchemy that drive the conflict within the narrative of Fullmetal Alchemist behind the scenes. So basically CIA, right? Inciting coups and shit to maintain our economic model across the globe. Also, the way capitalism promotes itself as the solution to the problem its existence causes is in line with something called the homunculus fallacy, an argument where a concept is explained in terms of itself without having to explain the original concept. God, this anime is so fucking cool. Now, none of this means that there are not sociopathic individuals amongst all this who we could better define under the more conventional ideas of evil. But they are not the norm. In fact, it is within both the capitalist and fascist best interest to distance themselves from those types of individuals, even after they were perfectly willing to use them. Take Kimberly from Fullmetal Alchemist. He is a psychotic individual who takes great pleasure in inflicting pain and taking life, and the Amestris military is more than willing to channel that energy towards their goals during the slaughter of the Ishvalan people. But when he becomes too difficult to control, and his pursuits threaten to give the game away, he is thrown in prison. These individuals are ideal for creating a false narrative that the problem resides in bad apples, but also cannot be allowed to show that their actions are acceptable under the system. In the capitalist system, this would be someone like PharmaBro. PharmaBro, or Martin Shkreli, was a pharmaceutical executive who raised the prices of multiple necessary medications by up to 5,000% in one case. And that's not even what he eventually was sent to jail for, because all of that was his legal right to do.
I walk by Pfizer's quote-unquote world headquarters, and they raise price all the time. In fact, they raised price on 100 drugs just last week, and nobody wrote anything about it.
They're companies, they have owners, and their owners demand that they extract as much profit as possible. And that's the rule of law today. If you don't like that, I don't know what to tell you. That's the way the world works.
You think this is our job? To cause tragedy?
Well, that's how it seems. I'll tell you what I don't get. Did you people expect something different?
I don't think many could create a hypothetical that so perfectly sums up the issues inherent to capitalism. Other pharma executives knew this too, showing anger not really at the actions, they all perform these price hikes for necessary drugs, but at him for being so bold about it. And hey, these practices are still legal. The outrage over this individual's actions became about the individual himself, providing an element of catharsis while never allowing the system through which Shkreli operated within to come into question. However, this doesn't explain people's willingness to dive into fascism from neoliberalism. If you'll excuse the metaphor, the tracks have been laid down, but it doesn't mean the train has to follow them. And that's how we arrive at alienation. Edward. Hey. Boss wants to see you.
You look familiar.
You look tired.
I'm drinking coffee.
Maybe have a tapeworm.
I don't see one.
Oh well. Boss still wants to see you.
That's my coffee.
My mug. By the way, your productivity is down from last week. And you should really drink some coffee. You look awfully tired. At the heart of Fullmetal Alchemist is a story about autonomy. I do mean in a thematic sense, but also quite literally. It is a story that revolves around two brothers attempting to get their bodies back after all, so I don't think I'm reading too far into it. On top of that, so much of the horror and violence of the show directly involves the robbing of others' autonomy. Autonomy, in the political sense, is having freedom from external control. And if there is one thing that champions of capitalism love to tout, it's freedom, baby! Be your own man. Set your own path. Defy the laws of physics by impossibly lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. It's pretty much the capitalist promise that self-interest and competition are the means by which society can maximize individual freedom, much like it is the Elric brothers' belief that the pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone will restore their autonomy. Spoiler alert, it's not how either of them regain their bodies, but we will get to that. And here's the thing. They theoretically could use the Philosopher's Stone to regain their lost bodies, but refuse to do so because they are able to recognize both the horror and the sheer contradiction of using other people's stolen souls to obtain their autonomy, which is kind of a perfect example for how capitalism cannot provide real autonomy to those in a capitalist society. Just going by what we have already discussed regarding the values inherent to maintaining a capitalist society, we can see a few problems. How, for example, do we square the idea that there are natural hierarchies that should be observed for the benefit of capitalism, and that same system maximizes autonomy? I guess if you just so happen to be on top of that hierarchy, then yeah, totally makes sense. In fact, there is a great deal of research into the ways that tenets of capitalist dogma are correlated with feelings of coercion and pressure, feelings that go against general feelings of autonomy. Not only that, the prioritization of capitalism's self-enhancing doctrine assures that the autonomy of the other is not observed. This is a quote from the collection Human Autonomy in Cross-Cultural Contexts. Stronger materialistic values are associated with being less empathetic, nurturant, and unconditionally accepting, with acting in more competitive and less cooperative ways during resource dilemma games, and with having more Machiavellian, manipulative, and socially dominant attitudes towards interpersonal interactions. Further, some research demonstrates that materialistic values are associated with more authoritarian and racist attitudes, and with engaging in more antisocial activities that violate the rights of others. Of course, this is not limited to ideology and manifests in both cultural systems and institutions. As an easy example of the former, we can look at the way that grind culture has become so prominent in places like the United States, fetishizing the prospect of working longer hours for little compensation as some path towards autonomy, paradoxically giving up any freedom one might have had in the first place, though it's likely that even then, that free time would be spent on some form of consumption, as that is the only way a capitalist economy can smoothly function. As for the latter, there is possibly no better example than the United States justice system, something we will discuss soon. An interesting way that Fullmetal Alchemist explores this is through the physical loss of autonomy perpetuated by Amestris's ongoing wars. Many of Amestris's citizens are left without limbs, either from displacement or combat, to the point that an entire business culture is created revolving around the creation of automail, FMA's spin on prosthetics. However, this automail is not provided equally. We are shown that many of the surviving Ishvalans lack limbs, but have no automail to show for it. And for the Amestrian citizens who wield automail, it is most assuredly for combat purposes, displaying the system's total disregard for those bodies that cannot fulfill its needs. Much like how in the capitalist system, conditions are met for those with physical disabilities so long as it helps them either work or consume. A byproduct of this lack of autonomy is something Karl Marx and many of his contemporaries referred to as alienation. Alienation under the capitalist mode of production takes many forms. Workers feel alienated from the work they produce, as they have no means of controlling either the process, design, or commodification of what they produce. Workers feel alienated from each other, as businesses and capitalist class create a highly competitive labor market, for which workers must fight amongst each other for higher wages and work that isn't actually scarce. And workers feel alienated from themselves, as human beings, relying on the system that subsequently forces them into acting as a commodity to the point that they no longer see themselves as the subject, but rather the object, and consume as a way of affirming their own identity to themselves and others, which of course does not actually correlate to expressions of autonomy, but does help foster a cycle that helps maintain the capitalist motto. You know, like in Oro's boy. Alphonse's experience in the show is an interesting exploration of this type of alienation. Alphonse is a soul bound to a suit of armor, or using our lens of deconstruction, a being attached to the world by labor. At times in the show, his alienation causes him to experience existential crises, questioning whether or not he is even a person with any real agency at all.
Are you sure you're not a puppet created by your so-called brother? Just accept it. You'll feel better.
It is also very clear that his is one of a few ideal states to be in for the purposes of the ruling class, more a commodity than a being with goals and aspirations. This is shown in the way some of the Amestris military engage with him, claiming that his personal hell of not needing to eat or sleep is actually a great thing because they cannot imagine a need for things that do not better their standing in the system.
You don't need to eat, you don't need to sleep, you don't even need to use the toilet. Sounds great to me.
Capitalists would love nothing more for humans to function as if they were machines. The need to eat, relieve ourselves, and socialize is nothing but a roadblock for a continuous profit flow. Obviously, with industrialization, more companies simply turn to machines to get around that. But even when they can't, they will do whatever is necessary to get around labor laws and human needs. Most workplaces implement methods of social control, like creating non-financial incentives for ignoring sickness and increasing their productivity output, and when that fails, putting constant pressure on workers to meet ever-growing productivity goals, Some places going as far to consider the use of actual tracking devices that inform bosses when a worker is idle for too long or takes too long of a break. I can say from experience that there is nothing more alienating than being chewed out for taking too long of a bathroom break when you share none of the profit that your increased productivity provides the company. This method of control is even more applicable to FMA, as Alphonse is not the only soul bound to a suit of armor. When the brothers break into a secret laboratory, they find 2 former prisoners who have had their souls torn from their bodies and placed in suits of armor to guard the facility. This is especially on the nose, as prisoners are used constantly as a slave labor force for major corporations, and even entire states, or in some instances, they become the subjects of human drug trials.
There's a prison right next door.
Okay, so?
What was the main ingredient for a Philosopher's Stone?
You said it needed live humans.
Ugh. There'd be plenty of condemned criminals in the prison.
It should go without saying, but prisoners do not possess any kind of bargaining power to negotiate fair compensation for their labor, and their prior crimes do not validate stripping their rights away. What's more, the prison system itself has become an industry that generates profit with the introduction of privately owned prisons, necessitating longer sentences, over-policing, and trumped-up charges to keep the bodies coming. This is reflected in record numbers of prisoners, despite drops in crime rates. I'd have to say that the idea that capitalism promotes freedom seems a little off.
I wanted to experience it! Free! I just wanted to be free! Free to know!
It is with this mass feeling of alienation that society finds itself most vulnerable to extreme political movements like fascism. When the consumption of commodities inevitably fails to affirm people's sense of autonomy, they most often turn to groups that seek to provide an answer for that question they do not quite understand how to articulate. Why does everything suck? In fascist's case, the answer is wrong, but simple enough to latch onto while simultaneously providing a sense of community, or of being a part of something, restoring in some small way the individual's perception of autonomy. By manipulating the ideology of neoliberalism, fascists affirm to those they wish to recruit that their alienation is simply the result of them not being in their rightful place amongst the hierarchy, that this is the result of outgroup meddling, the us versus them dynamic having already played a key role in their understanding of the world due to the nature of a competitive marketplace that needs to maintain a consumer base. Think of the way people are oftentimes staunchly a Coke person over a Pepsi person, or defend Apple over Samsung. Arendt makes note of the way that Eichmann moved into his position under the Nazi regime as being his desire to be a part of something he had a handle in. Arendt goes through Eichmann's life using both what was publicly available and Eichmann's own testimony to show that Eichmann was very much a joiner. There is, in fact, an interesting exploration of Eichmann's loss of joy in his work for the Vacuum Oil Company in 1932, after being transferred against his wishes the same year he joined the National Socialist Party and entered the SS. She notes that the year was a turning point in his life, quote, for whatever reason. And on top of that, Eichmann goes to great lengths to suggest that the final solution seemed obscene to him, but as he saw it, it was better to maintain his sense of autonomy by fulfilling his job to the best of his ability, rather than face isolation and social rejection. It is no surprise then that hate movements prey on those who have been most alienated from capitalist society to join the ranks of their organizations. In FMA, this is the catalyst for Edward and Alphonse's entry to the Amestrian military. It is only after the loss of their physical bodies that they are recruited to be, as the show puts it, dogs of the military. The promise of autonomy through work, or more to the point, the idea that work will set you free. The chilling words that greeted the one-way travelers to Auschwitz. It may seem strange that society can be so alienated when the methods of connection seem so strong. The world is more connected than I imagine Arendt or Marx could ever expect or predict, and yet, the danger remains, and if anything, it feels stronger as the world is opened up to new methods of social control through the same networks that promise connection. I think it's actually kind of poignant that the threat in FMA is the completion of a giant transmutation circle that connects all of Amestris. The avenues of connection become the delivery system for tyranny and the stripping of our autonomy, the same way that trains, the great connector of the 20th century, were used to deliver millions of people to their death.
So it's true then that Alchemic Incorporated was sacrificing people...
Prisoners.
For the creation of a philosopher's stones?
Yes. A philosopher's stone allows us to do our alchemy at less than equivalent exchange.
And you coordinated this through Freedom Works?
Yes, but I want to be clear, I did not kill anybody, and I certainly did not draft the plans to do so.
But you knew that they were killing these people, and you continued to utilize the service.
Look, this was not an ideal situation for me to be in, but I performed my job to the best of my ability. Isn't that what you do?
Well, that's not the...
It is. It is our responsibility to work hard. Sacrifices are made, but that's how the law of equivalent exchange works. I am quite proud to be a part of an economy that lifts people like myself out of poverty. But I did not get here twiddling my thumbs. I kept my head down, and I worked hard to be in the position I am.
You don't feel guilty signing them off to die?
I don't see why I should feel guilty. In fact, I am quite proud. We have provided millions of people with work and a valuable service at less than equivalent exchange. This is the way the economy works, and I can't be held solely responsible. Where is the responsibility of the consumer or of the lawmakers who let us do this under legal practices? Should we resurrect the drafters of the 13th Amendment and put them on trial? So no, I do not feel guilty.
If you've watched to this point, perhaps you are experiencing dread over the situation we find ourselves in. And there are certainly reasons those feelings are valid. There does seem to be a worldwide resurgence of explicitly right-wing governments and the violence that follows, and as the world still deals with a pandemic, billionaires increase their wealth and power while hundreds of thousands die from a horrible virus. Or maybe the feeling is apathy, numbness being a preferable alternative to the constant pain of knowing both that the system is cruel and that you as an individual cannot possibly dismantle it. What can even be done? The true evil of the system has yet to be experienced in full because the effects of global warming are still in their infancy. And none of the 100 companies most responsible are stopping. Hell, Exxon, the fucking company that knew about the horrors of climate change since the 70s and buried that information while also simultaneously pushing misinformation that still lingers today, are actually planning on increasing their carbon output. The effects of climate change that we are already experiencing kill and displace thousands while the most vulnerable are left to deal with the aftermath. All the while, the most powerful play pretend and gaslight us. Then, to add insult to injury, our collective productivity produces enough shelter, food, and water for every man, woman, and child on the planet, only for most of it to be dumped or unused for the sake of maintaining some sort of, economic model? Resulting in people continuing to die from starvation and exposure needlessly. Make no mistake, this is evil, and it carries on through the most banal of economic principles and motivations. It was not constructed by evil Satanists, and it does not have a drive of its own. Much like our world, the world of Fullmetal Alchemist is full of despair. But it is within the journey of the protagonist that hope can be found. The motto of the Elric brothers is, keep moving forward. Forward here being progress. It and the Elric brothers' unwavering belief in the value of life are what allow the two to not only deny fascist ideology, an ideology based on regression, but to eventually help dismantle the status quo. What's important to note though is that they do not do this alone. It is only after exposing the ideology for how it functions that collective action can come together to fight. And it will be a fight. The upper class are insulated in every sense. They appear to have reached what alchemy has promised, immortality. But it is ultimately an illusion. Collective action can break through their power. It is the reason why companies work so hard to break unions and stop any legislation that universally provides for people. They are confident that they can keep people divided and fighting for scraps, otherwise the wild levels of inequality might bother them. After all, why would you set yourself up against the other 99.9% of the world? They also have an endless amount of foot soldiers, people whose souls have been warped to validate their existence with consumption and maintain a zombie-like acceptance of the status quo.
They're mindlessly obedient. They are the world's most perfect soldier.
The use of zombies is noticeable because zombies in media are a great indicator of society's anxiety about becoming an unthinking horde of beings whose only connection to the material world is consumption. Remember, none of these people see themselves as evil. Much like Father removes from himself the 7 deadly sins in a misguided attempt to become a more perfect being, billionaires and those that defend capitalism use a similar backwards logic to defend inequality, claiming that those who have come out on top have simply done so through their own merit, without actually having to prove that. To them, the result is the proof. Most of the ultra-wealthy never actually contribute anything to begin with. It is others who create, and they simply reap the rewards by virtue of the fact that they own something, even if that something is just a name.
Only through them can a philosopher's stone be created, and only through a stone can a homunculus arise. But what does a homunculus produce? What do you create? Creation is all, and you've done nothing but destroy. You may think you've reached a perfect state of being, but in truth, all you've reached is a dead end!
To combat this, FMA suggests that individualism is no solution. When all seems lost, it is not Edward or Alphonse who saves the day. It is the disembodied souls who have maintained their identity through Hohenheim that are able to reverse the effects of the human transmutation process. A collection of souls claiming ownership over their use, a labor movement. Only through the coordinated action of the working class can there be hope for the liberation capitalism promised. None of this is possible without what I would surmise is the show's most important theme: empathy. I don't think there are many pieces of fiction that promote empathy, especially in its relationship with violence, as well as Fullmetal Alchemist. The empathy it helps build for the characters makes the consequences of violence all the more real, never shying away from showing us the danger that comes when we no longer feel for our fellow man. Look at the journey of characters like Scar, a former Ishvalan holy man turned murderous vigilante after the genocide of his people, a character whose very identity is marked and distorted by imperialistic violence. Scar's development comes when he lets go of his pursuit of vigilante justice in pursuit of dismantling the systems that perpetuated the destruction of his home and the death of his family. His actions in the beginning, though seeming just, only continue the cycle of violence that feeds the system, and I cannot stress enough how refreshing it is to be shown that. Scar actually has another relevant arc. Throughout much of the series, Scar uses the deconstruction half of alchemy to fight, but towards the end, he saves himself mirroring his own internal transformation by using the reconstruction half as well. Collective action is not just about dismantling what currently exists, but also about building the kind of future we want to see, whether that be building stronger communities through mutual aid, or just talking to people outside of our immediate circles. The last point I want to make is regarding the importance of critical thought. Remembering what we discussed about the danger of cliches, it is important that we all take the time to renegotiate our worldview, to always think critically about the world around us. Arendt recognized this as being the most critical aspect of any, quote, revolutionary change to the human condition, but makes the important suggestion that we should view ourselves in the collective instead of placing ourselves at the center of existence. For her, this could be summed up by her statement, "When one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend themselves as a Jew." But I think we can expand this line of reasoning to all of humanity, because these acts of evil and the dulling of our thought are an attack on our humanity. We have to break free from this capitalist realism. The last episode of Fullmetal Alchemist has two very important statements that sum up this thesis. The first involves Alphonse explaining to Maze Hugh's wife that her husband was a fucking genocidal maniac. No, actually, he's explaining to her the new understanding of alchemy that he and Edward are trying to construct. And just listen to how fucking simple it is for Alphonse to reconstruct the law of equivalent exchange.
We feel like it's our turn to repay the happiness that's been given to us.
Isn't that like what the alchemists believe? Equivalent exchange?
It's equivalent if you take 10 and then you give 10 back. But if you take 10 and then you add something of yourself, you return 11.
The second instance gives us a more fun but equally important confrontation. In a cute moment of closure for the relationship of Edward and Winry, Edward blurts out his desires to marry Winry, but because he is so nervous about it, he relies on his old method of thinking.
Equivalent exchange! I'll give half of my life to you if you give half of yours to me!
And in response, Winry unintentionally unravels his worldview.
Come on. You have to treat everything like alchemy? The whole equivalent exchange thing is just nonsense.
What'd you say?
It's nonsense! How about I just give you my whole life?
Genuinely, I love both of these scenes because it delivers a final knockout combination to the misguided ideology that has underpinned the world of Fullmetal Alchemist. And it's frustratingly simple. So simple you feel kind of silly for not having thought of it yourself. And it does it in a way that feels natural to the story's conclusion and the characters. Just absolute chef's kiss type shit. Arendt understood and advocated strongly that the best way of saving ourselves from the horrors of totalitarianism was to encourage this type of thinking, and that the way to do this was to go out and truly experience existence, so that we can reflect on it. To be, as Arendt describes it, an active philosopher. The Elric brothers are role models in this regard. And listen, I'm not here to tell you that Fullmetal Alchemist is a revolutionary text. It's really not. For one thing, a lot of the resolution to these large systemic problems within the show's view is to just get rid of the bad apples and replace them with the good apples, and assume they will, I don't know, just fix things. The show goes out of its way to suggest, quite genuinely, that the best thing to do is to change the system from within. And frankly, it's just bullshit. All this crap hits differently after 2020, honestly, but maybe that's just because it's more obvious in its naivety. Like, really, after Mustang gets the Führer position, he's going to put himself and every other alchemist on trial for war crimes? They'll just police themselves? Really? The show is not without its faults, but even with them, I love it. I love this show because at its core, it believes in fighting for what's right, to deny hatred and break past ideology, to not fall to despair but to move forward with the hope, no, the knowledge that things can get better. And fuck, man, I need that right now. We all do. Thank you for watching. Hey, thank you so much for watching that video. If you made it all the way till now, wow, that video was way too long. Congratulations. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Also, if you like the kind of video work we are doing, subscribe to us on Patreon. All the links will be down in the description below. You can also follow us at RomanBearPro on Twitter, as well as Instagram and OnlyFans.